October 28, 1944, Camp McAllister, Oklahoma. Dusk came cold and clean across the prairie, the wind threading through double runs of barbed wire and rattling the tin roof of a timber hall that smelled of damp canvas and coal smoke. A sentry of the 425th Military Police Battalion paused on his rounds, head cocked. From inside, through the thin boards, came a sound he did not expect from men who had fought under the chrysanthemum seal. Laughter, quick, startled, then rolling, unmistakably Japanese. Within, several hundred prisoners sat shoulder to shoulder on rough benches, steam rising from wool coats, eyes reflecting the white flare of a 16mm Army projector as a beam leapt to a stretched bedsheet. On the flicker, Clark Gable tipped his hat. A prisoner from Saipan, who had once been told surrender was shame, felt the odd, disarming tug of amusement and let it take him. The sprockets purred. The reel clicked forward. The air tasted of dust and warm oil. Months earlier, these men had been taught to die rather than yield. Now they watched comedies and travel shorts shipped in crate lots, part of a War Department routine that, under the safe cover of the 1929 Geneva Conventions, recreation provisions, spread across more than 500 U.S. branch camps holding hundreds of thousands of Axis POWs. The guards traded glances in the corridor. The projector hummed on. Outside, the war devoured steel and men. Inside, America tried a quieter weapon, habit, humor, and the everyday. The question was how such films found their way to a prairie outpost, and who decided they should. By the summer of 1942, the United States confronted an unexpected problem of victory: what to do with the swelling tide of captured Axis soldiers. American factories were at full roar, the Navy ruled the Pacific lanes, and troop convoys crossed the Atlantic. But behind the front lines, the War Department faced a new logistics campaign of its own. Under the strict terms of the 1929 Geneva Convention, Washington was obligated to treat prisoners humanely, granting them food, shelter, and even recreation equal to that of American troops. At first, the camps built across the South and Midwest, wooden barracks, barbed wire, guard towers, were meant simply to contain the enemy. Yet by 1943, with the arrival of the first Japanese prisoners from the bloody islands of Attu and Tarawa, the mission shifted from containment to conversion. To the Provost Marshal General's office, these captured men, so steeped in emperor worship and Bushido that many had tried to die rather than be taken, were paradoxically valuable. They were human evidence of an enemy mind to be studied and perhaps quietly re-educated. Within guarded walls at Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Camp Lordsburg in New Mexico, and Camp Huntsville in Texas, small orientation experiments began. English lessons were offered under the guise of camp activity. Leaflets and translated news articles described American life without censorship. And soon, reels of Hollywood film, musicals, comedies, and newsreels flickered against makeshift screens. The initiative divided the guards. Some mocked the idea of showing Yankee films to men who had sworn loyalty unto death. Others sensed that the laughter echoing from barracks signaled something deeper, a crack in the wall of indoctrination. By late 1943, reports from camp administrators filtered to Washington. Prisoners not only watched but discussed the films afterward, comparing depictions of American life to the rigid discipline they had known. What began as a moral duty evolved into a psychological experiment. America had discovered an audience it never expected, an enemy willing, if only for an hour, to look through Hollywood's eyes. In early 1943, as American victory in North Africa swelled the population of enemy captives, the War Department codified its responsibilities in a thick gray manual, Technical Manual TM 19/500, Prisoner of War Administration. It laid out every regulation of camp life with bureaucratic precision. The calories in a standard ration, the square footage per bunk, the process for mail censorship. But buried deep in Section 6 was a clause that carried more weight than its dry language suggested. Prisoners of war shall be afforded opportunities for recreation and education, including the showing of motion pictures, provided such material is non-political in nature. To the average officer, it read like a routine compliance note under the Geneva Convention. To the Special Services Division of the U.S. Army, it read like an invitation. If films could meet the letter of humanitarian law while quietly demonstrating the texture of American life, they could serve a dual purpose, relief and persuasion. By mid-1943, film libraries under the Army Service Forces were circulating thousands of reels across more than 500 POW compounds, transported in olive-drab trucks and cataloged with quartermaster precision. Each camp received a rotation of 16mm prints, MGM comedies like It Happened One Night, 1934. Paramount dramas such as San Francisco, 1936, and flag-waving musicals like Yankee Doodle Dandy, 1942, all projected through Bell and Howell model. 179 machines humming in wooden recreation halls. The reactions became a kind of barometer. German officers debated the moral looseness of American cities. Japanese prisoners, raised on tales of U.S. poverty and racial decay, stared in stunned silence at newsreels showing Chicago's glowing skyline and children licking ice cream. At Camp Kennedy, Texas, one report noted, "They did not believe such cities existed." The psychological warfare branch took notice. Without leaflets, slogans, or lectures, a new front had opened, a theater of persuasion measured not in miles or maps, but in flickering frames of light. By late 1943, the trickle of Japanese prisoners arriving in the continental United States represented a rare and complex kind of victory. Unlike the hundreds of thousands of Germans captured in North Africa and Europe, fewer than 6,000 Japanese soldiers would ever cross the Pacific as POWs. Most had been taken alive not by choice, but by collapse, pulled half-dead from caves on Tarawa, Kwajalein, or Saipan, their bodies starved and their spirits fractured. They came from an army that regarded capture as a fate worse than death. To the American guards who processed them at San Francisco's docks and then loaded them onto trains bound for the heartland, the silence was unnerving. No shouts, no complaints, just hollow faces, eyes that refused to meet anyone's gaze. When the first major contingent arrived at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, in November 1944, the shift in climate alone was a shock. The camp stood among pine forests dusted with early snow, ringed by barbed wire that hummed in the wind. The men who had once fought under a Pacific sun now watched their breath turn to steam. Army psychologists from the Military Intelligence Service, among them Captain Clyde S. McFarland, observed that pamphlets and orientation lectures achieved little. The prisoners neither argued nor engaged. They simply stared ahead. Then the Special Services Unit tried something different. Film. One night, a flickering projector cast Meet Me in St. Louis, 1944, across a stretched bedsheet. The colors were gone, only black and white now, but the effect was immediate. When Stagecoach followed a week later, prisoners began to murmur questions about the wide streets of American cities and the strange openness of its people. A guard later recalled hearing one man whisper that Americans lived like gods. The screen had done what words could not. It offered a glimpse of humanity unfiltered by propaganda. By early 1945, War Department directives formally endorsed motion picture exhibition as a legitimate tool for prisoner adjustment, quietly transforming entertainment into therapy. Every movie night in the camps began with a machine, a squat, steel-bodied Bell and Howell Model 179, the workhorse of the U.S. Army's Mobile Projection Corps. It weighed nearly 47 pounds and could survive a drop from the back of a truck without losing alignment. To the untrained eye, it looked like a metal suitcase bristling with knobs. To the men of the Special Services Division, it was a precision weapon of morale. Each week, film crates marked for POW exhibition only arrived from regional Army depots in places like Memphis or Dallas. Inside, reels were coiled in tin canisters, each about 200 feet long, enough for roughly 40 minutes of picture. Generators from General Electric supplied the current, their rhythmic puttering mixing with the dry rattle of prairie grass or the hum of desert wind, depending on the camp's latitude. Makeshift theaters sprang up wherever space allowed, mess halls, empty barracks, or open yards with linen screens stretched taut between poles. The white light of the carbon arc lamp cut through the dark, and with the whirring start of the motor, reality thinned. Notices were posted in Japanese, and guards often announced showings with bugle calls. Seating reflected the order of labor ranks, cooks in front, lumbermen and farmhands behind. But the moment the film began, all hierarchy dissolved in the shared flicker. At Camp Kennedy, one sergeant wrote that several Japanese prisoners became so entranced by the machine itself that they volunteered as projectionists, handling film like silk, cleaning the lens with folded cloth, and rewinding reels as if they were sacred objects. By 1945, more than 200 camps operated these mobile theaters under rigid regulations forbidding combat or propaganda films. Yet within those restrictions, an unplanned education unfolded. Through stories of romance, slapstick humor, and equality between men and women, the American way of life seeped past the barbed wire. What began as fascination with the machine became the first glimmer of ideological doubt. December 17, 1944, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. Snow fell in steady veils over the pine forest as hundreds of Japanese prisoners filed into the recreation hall, their breath white in the cold. Inside, the air smelled of kerosene heaters and oiled wood. On a whitewashed plywood screen, the title frames of Yankee Doodle Dandy, 1942, began to dance to the crackling sound of George M. Cohan's music. The guards of the 425th Military Police Battalion watched from the back, noting the stillness of the audience. There was no laughter, no murmur, only a silent study of faces illuminated by the projector's pale beam. These were men who had been told that Americans were lazy, immoral, and doomed by internal decay. Yet here, before their eyes, was a people singing about freedom, work, and pride in country, without fear of punishment or emperor. When Gone with the Wind screened several weeks later, the reaction deepened. The colors, even in monochrome prints, conveyed opulence beyond imagining: mansions, carriages, gowns, and endless fields of food. To men raised amid scarcity and military austerity, it was surreal. Sergeant Takeshi Arita, an interpreter who later testified after repatriation, wrote that the film destroyed everything we had been taught about American poverty. The shock was not violent but internal, a quiet crumbling of certainty. After each showing, Camp Chaplain Reverend Charles S. Thomas recorded the prisoners' questions. Why did Americans smile in public? Why did women speak before men? How could cities afford lights at night? The films became a mirror in which they saw both alien abundance and the possibility of another kind of life. By February 1945, Yankee Doodle Dandy and Gone with the Wind were circulating to Camp Huntsville and Camp Kennedy, where guards reported similar astonishment. Without a single lecture or slogan, America's image had changed from enemy to enigma. By the spring of 1945, what had begun as an act of compliance with the Geneva Convention had evolved into something far more strategic. Inside the Military Intelligence Service, MIS headquarters in Washington, officers reviewed camp reports that no longer read like routine administrative summaries. The entries spoke of prisoners who volunteered for English lessons, of reduced hostility during work details, and of conversations about democracy that followed film nights. The War Prisoners Division began compiling these findings into formal intelligence digests, recognizing that the 16-millimeter reels spinning across America's heartland had become unintentional instruments of re-education. The MIS's psychological warfare branch soon moved to formalize the process. It proposed that every major screening be paired with structured discussion sessions led by bilingual Nisei interpreters, second-generation Japanese Americans, trained in empathy as much as in language. These sessions were designed not as indoctrination but as comparison. The films showed a humane, confident America. The interpreters invited reflection on what Japan's future might look like without the militarist hierarchy. For the first time, cultural diplomacy entered the guarded compounds. At Camp McCoy, a select circle of cooperative prisoners, nicknamed the Co Group, were allowed to view edited versions of Why We Fight, 1943, and other American documentaries stripped of overt combat footage. These men, later repatriated, would assist U.S. occupation forces as interpreters and civic instructors, helping Japan navigate its reconstruction. The War Department now required detailed records, attendance logs, behavioral notes, even emotional observations, to measure what the films achieved. By August 1945, when the war's end loomed, those files told a quiet story of victory. Without coercion or interrogation, motion pictures had reached where military intelligence could not. They had turned the emperor's soldiers into students, willing observers of a democratic world they would soon help rebuild. By the early months of 1945, life inside America's prisoner of war camps had begun to resemble small, self-contained towns, quiet worlds with their own rhythms, routines and fragile bridges between enemies. The men who had once fought to the death now rose with the bugle, marched to work in farm fields or lumber mills, and returned to evenings that were slowly filling with culture. Baseball leagues sprang up in open lots. Gardening clubs tended neat rows of vegetables between the barracks. English classes filled notebooks with halting words of another world. But it was on film nights that the camp truly came alive. At Camp Kennedy in Texas, Japanese prisoners began reenacting scenes from the American movies they watched, crafting makeshift costumes and mimicking dialogue they barely understood. One skit, drawn from It Happened One Night, ended with raucous laughter that echoed through the compound. At Camp Huntsville, another group spent weeks carving miniature wooden cameras, sanding them smooth and gifting them to guards as tokens of respect, symbols of fascination with the technology that had first dazzled them. The screenings had become more than diversion. They were shared rituals, moments of fragile humanity framed by wire and watchtowers. A Texas sergeant later recalled standing in the back of the hall during It's a Wonderful Life as the audience gasped when the angel appeared. For a few minutes, he said, they forgot they were prisoners. Yet behind that fleeting grace was strategy. The War Department saw these emotional openings as the foundation of psychological demilitarization, the soft dismantling of loyalty through empathy. By early 1946, U.S. re-education efforts in occupied Japan would mirror these methods exactly. In the American heartland, under flickering reels and rustling pine, the first lessons of post-war democracy had already begun. By late 1945, the quiet experiment unfolding behind America's barbed wire had begun to ripple far beyond it. Reports compiled by International Red Cross inspectors and forwarded through Swiss diplomatic channels described in careful detail the cultural life of U.S. POW camps, English classes, orchestras, and, most curiously, regular motion picture exhibitions. These summaries reached both Berlin and Tokyo, where they provoked disbelief and irritation in equal measure. In Germany, Joseph Goebbels publicly mocked the idea as degenerate amusement for defeated men, sneering in his diary that America sought to soften the wolf by showing him vaudeville. Yet privately, his ministry commissioned an internal study on the potential moral disarmament of German soldiers through entertainment. Even in defeat, the regime recognized a dangerous truth. Culture could do what coercion could not. In the Pacific, captured Japanese intelligence officers told American interrogators in Manila that they, too, had heard rumors of prisoners in U.S. camps watching Hollywood films. Some considered it an unspeakable humiliation. Others confessed that it signaled American confidence, an empire so secure it could share its laughter with its captives. Among German POWs later repatriated in 1946, recollections of these screenings were strikingly similar. Many described the first stirrings of doubt about Nazi racial ideology while watching movies that portrayed mixed crowds, interracial music bands, and women commanding respect. Though the Japanese film program remained smaller, its symbolic weight was immense. It demonstrated, as the New York Times and the Christian Science Monitor observed, that America believed decency itself could be a form of warfare. The movie nights behind wire, as one headline called them, became evidence not of weakness, but of civilization's strength. In Tokyo, the concept would return only months later. when General Douglas, MacArthur's Civil Information and Education section used the same weapon, cinema, to rebuild Japan's soul from the ashes. Behind every flickering reel that lit the walls of America's POW camps stood a supply chain as disciplined as any battlefield operation. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, working in tandem with the Special Services Division, ran this vast cultural convoy with the precision of a military campaign. Each week, thousands of feet of film stock passed through the Signal Corps Photographic Center in Astoria, New York, where technicians duplicated Hollywood releases into durable 16mm prints suitable for camp projectors. From there, metal canisters, each stenciled with a depot code and the words War Department for POW exhibition only, were loaded onto rail cars bound for logistical hubs in St. Louis, Chicago, and Dallas. The distribution system ran like clockwork. Depot officers coordinated shipments alongside standard quartermaster freight, reels traveling in the same convoys that carried flour, tobacco, and medical dressings. By mid-1945, over 25,000 reels circulated monthly through more than 500 camps, reaching from Oregon's pine forests to the humid plains of Alabama. Military trucks delivered the crates to recreation officers who logged each screening and returned the reels for redistribution. Even the machinery demanded attention. Bell and Howell projectors, powered by portable General Electric generators, needed constant upkeep in the dust, heat, and humidity. When breakdown struck, particularly during the scorching Texas summers, it was often Japanese mechanics among the POWs who restored them, improvising replacement belts from ration box leather. Quartermaster reports from 1945 praised the exceptional morale value of the exhibitions, noting measurable reductions in disciplinary cases and absenteeism among work detachments. What had begun as a logistical courtesy evolved into an invisible campaign of persuasion. Each reel delivered not just images, but a vision of order, optimism, and freedom. Proof that the same industrial machine that forged tanks and bridges could also project ideas. Even after Japan's surrender, those trains kept running into 1946, carrying not weapons of war, but the light of reconstruction. By 1946, the quiet experiment in America's POW camps had become a documented psychological case study. The War Department, working alongside the International Red Cross, compiled its final evaluations of the film exhibition program, and the results were astonishing. Prisoners who had attended regular screenings displayed measurable differences from those who had not. Cooperation levels rose, violence and suicide attempts fell, and interpreters reported unprecedented openness. What years of imperial indoctrination had hardened, light and laughter had begun to soften. At Camp McCoy, guards noted a visible change even in posture. Men who once marched stiffly in silence now carried themselves with ease, speaking more freely during work shifts. An intelligence officer recorded a remark overheard during a discussion after a film night. If this is America, then Japan must change. To the Military Intelligence Service, this was evidence of transformation, not ideological conversion, but curiosity. The rigid code of obedience to emperor and hierarchy was giving way to something subtler, awareness of choice. Not every prisoner was moved. Some senior officers refused to attend screenings, branding them as moral traps. Yet the general trend was clear enough that the War Department's psychological warfare branch deemed the experiment operationally effective. When repatriation began in late 1946, aboard Liberty ships such as the SS Ernie Pyle and SS Marine Falcon, many Japanese POWs carried with them vivid recollections of those film-lit nights. In post-war Japan, these same men would become teachers, translators, and policemen, quiet architects of a redefined nation. For them, America's first lesson had not come through force, but through the flicker of a projector bulb. The real collapse of propaganda had occurred not on the front lines, but in the barracks of Wisconsin and Texas. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the United States faced a task unlike any in modern history: transforming an empire built on obedience into a democracy grounded in choice. The blueprints for that cultural reconstruction were not drafted in Tokyo, but refined years earlier in the quiet POW camps of Wisconsin, Texas, and Oklahoma. The same psychological principles that had turned enemy soldiers into students now guided General Douglas MacArthur's Occupation Authority through its Civil Information and Education Section, CIE. Film, tested behind barbed wire as a tool of persuasion, became the central instrument of re-education. Under CIE supervision, mobile theaters and civic halls across Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya began screening the very same titles once shown in captivity: Yankee Doodle Dandy, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and It's a Wonderful Life. Millions of Japanese civilians watched these films not as curiosities, but as windows into another moral universe, one that celebrated individuality, equality, and optimism over sacrifice and hierarchy. In a striking continuity, some of the interpreters who helped translate these screenings were themselves former POWs, fluent in English thanks to camp classrooms and cinema nights. Their ease with American idioms and values made them natural mediators between conqueror and citizen, smoothing the fragile transition to democracy. Historians later traced this bridge of understanding back to the American heartland, where the first sparks of cultural dialogue had been kindled. The POW camp, it seemed, had been a rehearsal for national rebirth, a controlled experiment proving that culture could disarm ideology. By 1948, educational films produced under U.S. guidance became part of Japan's public school curriculum. The same reels that once projected war's victors now projected its lessons. Hollywood's light had traveled full circle, from weapon to teacher, from entertainment to philosophy. By the spring of 1947, the movie projectors went quiet. The last groups of Japanese prisoners, men who had arrived emaciated and wordless 3 years earlier, boarded trains bound for the Pacific coast. From there, they would sail home on Liberty ships like the SS Marine Falcon and SS Ernie Pyle, carrying with them more than duffel bags and memories of captivity. The camps they left behind, McCoy in Wisconsin, Huntsville, and Kennedy in Texas, stood empty, their mess halls shuttered, the wire fences humming in the wind. In recreation buildings, dust settled over rows of wooden chairs and the silent hulks of Bell and Howell projectors once bright with life. The reels, Yankee Doodle Dandy, Stagecoach, It's a Wonderful Life, were packed into quartermaster crates and shipped to storage depots, labeled obsolete. For many guards, the silence felt unnatural. The nightly screenings, the odd rhythm of shared laughter and applause, had become part of their own war. Some corresponded with former prisoners who sent letters of thanks, one writing, "The pictures showed us freedom. Now I hope to live it." Others promised to bring the spirit of those films back to Japan, where a new generation would soon rebuild under the same democratic ideals they had once watched in disbelief. Meanwhile, in Hollywood, studios turned their lenses toward post-war stories of peace and redemption, unaware that their wartime comedies had served as psychological weapons. The official record barely mentioned the experiment, buried beneath atomic headlines and diplomatic milestones. Yet its legacy lingered, not in policy papers but in memory. In darkened barracks thousands of miles from home, America had revealed its greatest strength. Not its armies, but its imagination flickering on fragile celluloid. The final reels spun down, leaving only silence and the faint scent of warm film. In the end, the tale of Japanese prisoners watching Hollywood films is not a story of diversion, but of redemption, proof that humanity can survive even inside the machinery of war. Where the world outside thundered with artillery, inside the fences a softer power was at work. The United States had chosen not to humiliate its captives, but to project light, literal and moral, into the shadows of defeat. Within those guarded compounds, the steady whir of a Bell and Howell projector became the sound of reconciliation, its glow washing over faces once hardened by devotion to an emperor. For a few hours each night, the roar of battle gave way to laughter, and hatred gave way to wonder. In that shared darkness, enemies became witnesses to each other's humanity. The men who had once believed Americans were devils now saw them as people capable of music, kindness, and humor. From those flickering images of freedom, equality, and joy, a bridge stretched quietly across the Pacific. Its echoes would shape post-war Japan's democracy, its art, and its openness to the world. When the final reel clicked empty and the lights rose, something irreversible had happened. Understanding had been manufactured, frame by frame, scene by scene. Behind barbed wire, America had fought its most peaceful battle, and won it with a movie.